Mr. President, I spent the last few days having town hall meetings at home. It was a big challenge. We had a tremendous amount of snow. The distinguished president of the Senate is very familiar with that, but on my driveway in southeast Portland, I guess we had the most snow since 1937. And it just goes on and on. We're battling freezing rain. And yet, Oregonians came out in big numbers to participate in the discussion about what's going on in Washington, D.C., and they were particularly troubled about what was being done at the Environmental Protection Agency and the nomination of Scott Pruitt to head it. We had 200 people in McMinnville on Saturday night, small community. I think the temperature was about 22 degrees. And what really troubled them is that it sure looks, when you examine the record of Mr. Pruitt, that he's trampling on everything that we call the Oregon Way. The Oregon Way is something that Democrats and Republicans, people across the political spectrum, subscribe to because it involved protecting our treasured land, air, and water. And it was something that we wanted for our generation. We wanted to be able to pass it on to our kids. And it has been hugely valuable to us in attracting more industries that pay well because the workers at those industries want clean air and clean water. And when you look at Mr. Pruitt's career, it really upends everything that I would call the Oregon Way. Repeated attempts to weaken or eliminate health-based environmental standards, air quality standards for toxic air pollutants, limits on carbon emissions to take on the challenge of climate change. And these rollbacks are particularly harmful to children in low-income households, communities of color, minorities, families, and communities. Yesterday, Senator Merkley and I spoke at our wonderful Martin Luther King breakfast put on by the Scanner. Bernie and Bobby Foster have been doing this for years. And all I could think of, Mr. President, is if you roll back clean air and health standards, the people who are going to be hurt the most are those low-income minorities, the communities of color. And I don't see a big outcry in America for policies that would do that kind of harm to some of the most vulnerable Americans. Mr. Pruitt also has a troubling history of denying that fundamental science really ought to be the basis of American policymaking when it comes to environmental protection. For example, he disputed the agency's science-based finding in 2009 that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. Now, my view is that this is an inarguable and unfortunate reality of climate change. But Mr. Pruitt's challenge suggests either a misunderstanding about how environmental agencies ought to make science-based decisions, or even worse, a habit of setting science aside when the outcome is at odds with the special interests. And again, that comes back, Mr. President, to the kind of comments that were made during my 5 town hall meetings over the last few days at home. People would say, look, Democrats and Republicans at home in Oregon, great Republican governors, particularly led by the late Tom McCall, they would constantly come back to the proposition that you shouldn't let the special interests trample on your treasures, your land and your air and your water, because not only was it bad for this generation, our generation, but it would be particularly damaging to our young people. So it is really troubling that this has been the choice of the president-elect. My own view is, when it comes to environmental standards, one of the unsung successes of the last few years has been a rule cutting emissions of mercury and arsenic and lead and other dangerous materials. It prevented in 2016 11,000 premature deaths. And my guess is a lot of those deaths would be seen in minority communities, in communities of color, the people I was concerned about when we had our Martin Luther King Day breakfast. Mr. Pruitt worked hard to gut that rule. He really pulled out all the stops to oppose a rule cutting emissions of mercury, arsenic, lead, and dangerous heavy metals. He worked hard to gut it. If he's confirmed, he may just possibly be successful. Now, the message that I've heard again and again is that we can do better than this. We can do better than this. And I think the American people, when they see what's at stake, because it's been hard to follow all of the hearings, I know that I was very interested in the questioning in the Foreign Relations Committee, the distinguished president of the Senate, and I was trying to follow all the nominations, and I couldn't get to all the hearings, and I couldn't follow all of the questioning that I thought was important. But even with all that is going on, when people tell you before a Trailblazers game at home in Portland, at a pregame event, that they're unhappy about the environmental rules and the prospect of the environmental rules being gutted by the new head of the EPA, you know that you've got people alarmed. Oregon is no stranger to the threats of pollution. In 2015, there was a discovery that heavy metals, including cadmium and arsenic, had been emitted for decades into the air of Portland neighborhoods at dangerous levels. This pollution was caused by a regulatory loophole the size of Crater Lake. And at the time, I called on the Environmental Protection Agency to take action. Within days, they were on the ground in Portland, helping to assess the public health risks. And not long after, they identified the cause of the regulatory oversight and corrected course. It seems to me that Americans need to trust that the Environmental Protection Agency will be able to defend their communities from air pollution or from water contamination. That's how we've always looked at it in my home state of Oregon. We always felt that we could trust those that we elected of both political parties for years and years to say, you don't mess with Oregon's land and air and water. Now, obviously, we've continued, even with that ethic, to have problems. And that was why I was pleased that we were able to get some significant public health changes after we made that discovery in 2015, that there were heavy metals, including cadmium and arsenic, in the air of our neighborhoods. So we've got to do better. We've got to do better at every level of government, and the EPA plays a critical role in ensuring clean and safe water, whether the water is running through a mountain stream or through a pipe to a Portland kitchen. Cities across the country, like my hometown of Portland, are facing threats with high levels of lead in the water supply and outdated infrastructure to fix the problem. These communities are counting on the Environmental Protection Agency to be in a partnership with them to get this fixed, to enforce strong water quality standards, and it only can happen if you have strong leadership that starts at the top. The American people have a right to have confidence that the head of the Environmental Protection Agency is going to defend the health and well-being of our communities and not the profits and the pocketbooks of the most powerful special interests in our country. Mr. President, I'm going to close by saying I'm not confident that a Pruitt EPA will stand on the side of those families against the special interests. And that's why tonight I state that I will be opposing the nomination of Mr. Scott Pruitt to head the Environmental Protection Agency. With that, I yield the floor.